Thank you very much. I start each day as an economist, and in the last 4 to 8 years, what I've said is that I've been unemployed for the last 20 years. I want to talk about the three C's of leadership. As President Brophy asked me to think about this set of issues, I thought about three things that were important to me, so I'm going to give you three short vision A's. And I finally said, well, let's do something alliterative. So let's talk about chance, collaboration, and creation, which are three elements of leadership. One of the key concepts in economics is called epiphenomenality. I had a student, when I was teaching micro at one point, say to me, what's epiphenomenality? And the student came back to me and said, it's who'da thunk it. It's those unexpected surprises that happen in life. And you've got to be ready for them in leadership. Let me give you a short example. I was finishing my first year in graduate school in Washington, D.C. Went to a cocktail party at the end of the year. Started to talk to a guy about public policy. And in D.C. cocktail parties, as in many cocktail parties, you don't spend 2 hours talking to somebody very often. But I talked to this guy and I had a wonderful conversation with him. And at the end of the conversation, and I spent a good deal of time, this was at the beginning of the Nixon administration, and this was a Saturday night. And so I talked to him and I said that Spiro T. Agnew I thought was not the best representative of leadership that I had ever thought of in my life. I thought he was a schmuck, actually. And I was pretty vociferous in my opinions. And at the end of the discussion, the guy looked at me and said, well, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. I've got to go to work tomorrow morning, Sunday morning. Didn't think he was a priest. And so I said, great. And he said, if you ever want a job, give me a call. Here's my card. And I did this standard American response. Took the card, put it in my pocket, never looked at it, said, great. Finally went off, went home, went to bed. I was in a dormitory at the time, so I took the card out, put it in my wallet, never looked at it. 6 months later, I said, I want a job. So I pull out the card, and he was the deputy director of the White House Office of Personnel. The Nixon White House Office of Personnel. And so I called him, and he remembered me, and 2 weeks later, I was working in the White House. Okay? That's chance. So looking for opportunities is something that is fundamental to leadership. Second C, collaboration. When I became president of the Independent College Association, I got the folder that every CEO, and I'm sure you got this CEO when you took over First American, a folder of what my predecessor hadn't quite finished. And in that group of goodies that I got was a sheaf of business cards. And they were from Mexican university rectors. And my former boss had spent in the about 5 or 6 years before I became president, had gone to the city of Oaxaca and had given a speech and had done the sort of standard American thing that a lot of Americans do with Mexico. So we went down there and said, we want to work with you, we want to help you, and then never called them back. Okay? So I looked through these 50 or 60 business cards, found one that had an email address, wrote this guy on email, had a standard California vocabulary of Spanish, which was at that time 400 words. Didn't hear anything. About 3 months later, got a call from a woman who had very broken English who said, the rector would like to speak to you in San Diego. He only has a half an hour tomorrow, but he'd like you to come and speak to him. I was living in Sacramento, obviously, because that's where my association was. And I was foolish enough to go down there and meet this guy, and we became fast friends. And over the next 20 years, built a set of collaborations with Mexican universities that has enriched the life of the universities that I worked with in California, including Marymount Palos Verdes. And to make that collaboration work, I had to take your idea about eco a bit. I had to understand the environment that I was working in. So over age 50, I had to learn Spanish. Now, my language in graduate school was German. And German and Spanish are not exactly the same language. Okay? I also had to listen pretty well. I had a person who is a dear friend who's a Catholic priest now in Jalapa, who was the rector of a university, and I brought him up here to visit some universities, and at the time we had this great discussion, and we'd stop in the computer lab, and every time, this was right at the time when American universities were going from 486s to Pentiums. And Father Dermot would come in and he'd talk to the computer director, and the last university that we visited, he pulled his wallet out and handed the guy some money. And I was on the other side of the room, and I was a little bothered by that. And I was embarrassed to say anything to him. And finally, I was back down at his university after this visit. And he said, I saw you out of the corner of my eye, and I think you were a little bummed out by this. But I'd like to show you what we did. And he bought up, in the end, from our universities, 50 old 486s, put a $50 card in it, and built the first computer lab on that campus for his students, okay? No American university would ever do that. We always want the fastest and the best and things like that. So no American university. So I learned something, so I had to learn something about the culture in the background. And what ultimately happened from that leadership experience was the opportunity to essentially understand that universities, especially, which I worked with for 40 years, can do things differently. Our sort of standard way of looking at the world can change dramatically if we just stop and listen for a bit. Third C is creation. The last Secretary of Education was a woman named Margaret Spellings. And I guess it isn't appropriate in a group like this to explain my feelings about Secretary Spellings, but just say they were relatively negative. In fact, I take away relatively. And she said it's really horrible about how American colleges and universities work. It's really hard to understand. This is a complex buying decision, and we ought to be able to slap a new car sticker on a college so that moms and dads and students can figure out what goes on in a college, and they can make a decision just like buying a car. And I thought about that, and I thought, A, it was silly, which it was, but B, I started to say, okay, so why can't we tell our story a little bit better? And so I sat down, and I had the joy of having a woman that worked for me who was a great designer. And so we started playing around with designs and stuff like that, and I came up with a set of ideas that eventually grew into something called the University and College Accountability Network. Now includes 800 colleges across the country. And it is a short, clear explanation of what the college is like. So I took it to our national organization, and I had the president of Grinnell College say to me, you can't do this. We can't explain Grinnell College in 150 words. And we had to have pictures and all this kind of stuff. And I fought like hell for the first couple of meetings that we had about this. And then I stepped back for a minute. And I said, what's the principle we're trying to get here? And if you reduce the principle down to something that was important, what it was to give students and families a better understanding of what colleges and universities were about. So it had to be a picture, it had to be auditable data, because quite frankly, some colleges don't always tell the truth about themselves, okay? And it had to be on 2 pages, so it had to be simple. But college is a complex buying decision. So we had to be able to drive back to the website. So if you want to learn about campus safety, you could do that. And when I said those 3 principles, all of a sudden, the creative juices of everybody else came into play. I'd set the tone, but by stepping back, by in essence making this become almost an open source activity, what we ultimately came up with was something that was useful for students and families in colleges and universities. So as I look at leadership, at the end of at least my first career, which spanned 40 plus years, chance is always important, understanding the opportunity of epiphenomenality. Collaboration, figuring out how to work with people and listen to people, and creation, thinking about good ideas and letting them nurture among the crowd is important.